The dollar and the oil price are just two measures that have changed markedly since our Prime Minister was last in the United States. And with new policy initiatives on both sides of the Pacific and active trade agendas, there was plenty to talk about with President Obama and his officials. Joining me a short time ago to tease out some of these issues, Geoffrey Garrett, Executive Director from the US Studies Centre at Sydney University. Geoffrey Garrett, welcome to Lateline Business.
My pleasure to be here.
Well, let me go to carbon pricing first. And President Obama's ETS obviously fell over. Do you think he had any words of advice to the Prime Minister in the Oval Office, or was it more of you're on your own?
Well, I think the Prime Minister is on her own, at least for the moment, where a carbon price or an emissions trading scheme is concerned. But obviously, one thing Barack Obama has said is that he wants to transition the US to a green tech economy and create lots of green tech jobs through lots of green tech investment. That's a sort of more, if you will, a direct action approach than the carbon price approach that the Prime Minister has chosen. Yeah, although I don't think he's talking about planting a lot of trees and soil carbon. He's thinking much more about solar, wind, electric cars, things like that.
Our Prime Minister, of course, wants a farm bill as well for 2012 that promotes trade rather than continues to subsidise. How realistic is that, given the state of the US economy?
I'm not sure it's very realistic, and I think the most important element of that is that the Prime Minister's called this it's the year of decision. It's supposed to be the year of decision, according to her, on the Doha round as well. My sense is that the calculation in the US remains the same as it's always been on Doha, which is the domestic political price to pay is just too high when American benefits don't look as large as they do for a big agricultural exporter like Australia.
I guess the best hope she has is that the US will need to cut its budget somewhere.
The US needs to cut its budget, but those farm subsidies typically are pretty sacrosanct. I mean, what we've seen thus far, I think, from Obama on the budget is a lot of symbolism about budget cuts, but really pushing the tough decisions off into the future, and in particular off to the Republicans in Congress. And up until now, it doesn't look as if they're ready to take on the challenge.
You mentioned what Julia Gillard wants in Doha. She's also pushing for this trans-Pacific free trade zone. We seem to slice and dice trade groups regularly. What would be the particular advantage of a trans-Pacific free trade zone?
Well, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, actually is something that Obama is pushing very hard. And I think part of that is about recognizing that probably an Asia-Pacific free trading regime is easier to achieve than a global one in the current environment. But I think it's also true that TPP for Obama serves geopolitical purposes. It would signal that the US is back in Asia in an institution that the US helped create rather than something like the East Asian Summit.
Do you think that they'll both have something to announce before APEC?
No. The big question is whether Obama, in one of his hometowns, Honolulu, in November, will be able to announce a deal on TPP that then could be ratified by the US Congress. I'm not sure that will be achievable. Probably what Obama will look for first is to get the Korea-US free trade deal done and to get Japan into the TPP as a negotiating partner. If both of those could happen before November, I think those would be real achievements.
Julia Gillard has also got meetings with Timothy Geithner and the Federal Reserve Chair Ben Bernanke. What's likely to come out of those meetings, do you think?
Well, Tim Geithner, I guess the story could be both the domestic budgetary situation and US-China trade and currency. The dollar RMB exchange rate is always a big political issue in the US, but I actually think that for the US administration and for American big business, it's not the big story with China. The big story is market access and intellectual property theft. Moving on to Ben Bernanke, American monetary policy looks very different from Australian monetary policy and probably will continue to. The QE2, the quantitative easing, continues. There's no evidence of a tightening of American monetary policy anytime soon.
Yes, the world just raises its eyebrows and it continues.
Yeah, but I think the story there, if you compare, the Eurozone with the United States, is that global markets are just still much more tolerant of loose monetary policy and loose fiscal policy in the US than they are anywhere else. So I think talk of sort of the demise of the dollar as a global currency is still a bit premature.
Any chance that financial regulation will be one of the subjects that Julia Gillard talks about? I see Mervyn King in London has come out with some very aggressive words against the finance industry last week.
Yeah, and if you look back at 2010, I think one of the things that probably passed with less notice than it might have received is the fact that the Obama administration got through Congress a big financial re-regulation package that really looked a lot like what the world wanted from the US. But two caveats. The first one is that they pushed off in the US a lot of the detailed implementation into the future. So it was really a heads of agreement kind of deal. And second, the US deal you would expect would be a blueprint probably for G20 regulation, but there's no evidence that that's happened, that there's momentum to having that happen. In fact, the G20 is looking a little sluggish as an institution after all the hype from 2010, 9 and 10.
The oil price is pretty scary. We've got all these unknowns in the Middle East, and now the White House press secretary says dipping into US strategic reserves is indeed an option. Is that likely?
I think it's likely, but what it also tells you is the energy security story in the United States is essentially all about oil. They've got a lot of natural gas, they've got a lot of coal, so they can do energy production. Retail energy production is not an issue. It's really about the transport sector and oil. And I guess for China, the US and Australia, there's a very interesting phenomenon, which is that all those countries have got a lot of coal. Australia and the US have a lot of gas. When we talk about energy insecurity, it still is about Middle Eastern oil above all. So there's no surprise to me that both the US and China are doing all they can to try to reduce their dependence on Middle East oil. So maybe those aren't climate change moves, maybe those are energy independence moves.
President Obama did have some good news on the US unemployment rate, didn't he?
Yes.
Below 9%. Do you think this is the beginning of a trend?
Well, unemployment was always going to be the lagging indicator here with respect to the American recovery. So if you look at GDP growth, obviously it's been robustly positive now for more than a year. You look at the stock market, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was at 6,000. It's now above 12,000. We think that there's probably about $2 trillion in cash sitting on corporate balance sheets. All of those are very positive signs, but they weren't going to, they didn't matter politically until they affected the unemployment number. So the fact that it was hovering around 10 and is now under 9, I think is extremely good news for Obama and probably heralds a great year for him politically, let's hope economically as well.
Geoffrey Garrett, very good to have your insights this week. Thank you.
My pleasure as always, Tiki.